Hello, my name is Demet Tunc, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this edition of the Off the Shelf book series, a book discussion brought to you by the Conference Board. Today, I will be sitting down with Kate Lanz to discuss her book, All the Brains in the Business. The power of gender difference, not gender equality, is a secret source for success. Properly valuing brain gender diversity in the workplace is a competitive advantage. This book, which is co-written by Kate Lanz and Paul Brown, explores how the brain works and how it impacts the performance of individuals and the teams. Kate, it's a pleasure to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here, Demet.
What has inspired you to write this book, Kate?
Yes, absolutely. The book was inspired by working with some of my wonderful clients back in just post the financial crisis, the crash, and there were lots of very odd, difficult behaviors that were occurring. And so I got very interested in what does it take to cause the conditions for optimal brain performance at work, because the brains I was working with were under too much stress and not performing well. So I started to really investigate that very deeply. And as I got into my research and investigation and work with clients, it became very obvious very quickly that if you're really serious about optimal brain conditions, you can't ignore gender. And brain gender diversity does make a difference, and it's little understood. And I want as many people to hear about it as possible. So I wrote the book, and practicing what we preach, I wanted to write it with Paul. So it's partnering between the brain gender differences.
Well, there are apparently structural differences between the female and the male brain, and the brain gender is not necessarily determined by our biological sex. Is that right?
Yeah, so it's an interesting. There are three layers of, or three big differences between male and female brains. There are differences in structure. There are differences in neural connectivity and how the patterns work in the brain, and there are differences in the amount of hormones and neurotransmitters in the brain that vary between men and women. And so the underpinning, we have a sort of biological underpinning to our brain sex. So that's what we're given by nature. That then blends with our experiences growing up, which provides the way our brains express themselves by nurture. So, and those two things combine to give you your brain sex. So, for example, I have two sons. Their biological brains are, of course, male. Yet the way those express themselves, one has a very male brain, and one has a brain that's slightly more in the female side of the brain sex spectrum. So it is indeed, as you say, possible to have a brain sex score that is different from your actual physical sex, which is really interesting.
So, why is it important to understand this to get the maximum potential of the brain?
It's really, really important, and this was why I wanted to write the book, so that I was talking to more people than just my wonderful clients. Because if imagine driving a car with the handbrake on, it kind of doesn't make sense and it ruins the car eventually. It's the same with your brain. So if you're working in an environment where your brain is not being given the conditions that allow for optimal performance, you're driving your car with the handbrake on. And so really understanding brain gender differences and creating the conditions where the brain can come in the person can show up in their natural form at work, as opposed to trying to be something that they're not. So hence the title of the book, All the Brains in the Business. Because what I'm finding in my research is that organizations, mostly unintentionally, are just simply not getting the best out of the brain diversity that they have. So they've got this very potent, the most potent thing you've got in the business, your people and their brains, and they're under leveraging them.
Well, so it is important to leverage the brain power. And I remember reading in your book that the average loss of brain power potential on a regular working day is 30%. That
Yeah.
is huge. So
Yeah, massive.
that is massive. And you talk about this gender difference and not gender equality at the same time. And you say that this is actually a competitive advantage for the businesses. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, completely. Because what you want to do is unleash the full creative power and agility of all the brains in the business, not just a subset. So, what I found in the research is that brains that tend to be at the more male end of the brain sex spectrum are the ones that spend more of their day in thrive. Brains at the sort of the more female end, be they in men or women, are brains that are spending considerable chunks of their day in a survive neurochemical state and not a thrive neurochemical state. And what we know from the brain science is that when you're in a survive state, the most powerful bit of your brain, which is the prefrontal cortex, that's the bit that does the really clever thinking and solutioning and creativity, that bit is not working at its full potential if your brain is in survive and not thrive. And so it just makes absolutely no sense in terms of the individual's well-being and the business case, the return on investment on that person's brain. So what I'm trying to do is help educate people, raise awareness about these brain sex differences so that leaders can really make sure that they're creating the conditions where all the brains feel welcome and then therefore can perform at their best.
So, knowing as much as you can about your brain and also the brains of your teams and colleagues is probably the way to um, have a competitive advantage to enable the
Absolutely.
conditions that create the optimal energy flow, so that you get the maximum of all the brains in the business. Is that right?
Absolutely, yeah, completely. And what I find, Demet, and it's the interesting distinction between, diversity and inclusion. So a lot of the clients I work with are working really hard with really positive intent to bring diversity into their workplaces, but then inadvertently, because they're kind of brain gender blind. So it's not a malicious ignorance. It's just simply people don't know this stuff. They can't include the brains. And a brain that feels genuinely included will operate at its absolute best. So what's happening a lot of the time is diverse brains are being invited in and recruited and trained and promoted, but they're not being included in a way that feels kind of brain friendly in inverted commas. And in order to be truly brain friendly, like I say, you just simply cannot ignore brain sex difference. And it's
Very
not binary, as we've said. It's not like all men's brains are like this and all women's brains are like that by no stretch of the imagination. It's far more subtle and personal and complex.
Okay, very interesting. Now we're going to take a short break for some quick announcements, and we will be back in just a minute to continue this fascinating conversation with Kate Lanz on the book All the Brains in the Business.
Looking for additional business insights in this subject area and beyond this podcast, go to tcb.org and explore our Human Capital Centre. Uncover a large array of products hosted by the Conference Board in focus areas like diversity and inclusion, talent management, and many others. Products include peer-to-peer networking events, expert briefings, publications, data and analysis, webcasts, videos, and blogs.
Hello, welcome back to our conversation with Kate Lanz on the book All the Brains in the Business. Kate, we are going through a very difficult time. Everything is more complex than ever. And the leaders are very busy with so many things. And how can these busy leaders get the best out of the different gender brains? What is a way for them to understand the differences, and how can they get the most out of their teams and also their potentials?
Yeah, absolutely. So now more than ever, it's important to really know how to, manage our own brains at an individual level, and certainly as leaders, to create the context virtually to enable the best of the brains of all your teams. And I think what I'll do, Demet, is talk about one of the models that I developed as part of the research and have been testing with clients for the last couple of years, and also very interestingly working with remotely. So the brain works bottom up. So the limbic brain, the emotional brain, is responding to our environment far faster than our rational brain, which comes on stream about 3 times more slowly. And the limbic brain has the capacity to decide where the brain energy flows. So if it thinks you're under enough threat, it will take all the energy in order to put you in a survive state to keep you safe. It's only if the limbic brain stands down and allows the cortex, the thinking part of the brain, to come on stream, that you can do your best thinking. So when you're working remotely with your teams, it's really important to soothe and settle the limbic brain first before you can start to engage with the cortex and the curiosity and the brilliance that it can produce. And so the way to do that, one of the models that I look at is called the 4 C's. So very simple, but very powerful. So connect and compassion are the 2 actions you need to take first to settle people's limbic systems, and then curiosity and control in order to get the best of the prefrontal cortex. And it just very simply, so we feel connected. So it's find ways to connect with everybody in the virtual environment and make sure people feel seen, heard, considered, and do that with real compassion. Some people will have different circumstances that are harder, more difficult than others. But when we know that our leaders are looking out for us, that's a very soothing thing to the brain. And you can do that at all sorts of levels, from micro levels in a meeting or bigger meta levels. We can talk more about that. And then curiosity, it's like find out what all the brains in that meeting think. So I've been talking a lot to clients during lockdown about, don't have meetings where everybody's like super engaged, otherwise don't bother. So, if you're off making your tea or doing the ironing while you're in a meeting, that isn't it. Your brain isn't really online. So be curious about what all the brains in that meeting think. And then give the control pieces about give people the genuine airtime given their brain to express the thought. And that will be different potentially between male and female brains. It will be different between introverted, extroverted brains. And so forth. So it's a very simple model, but it's very potent in terms of creating brain-friendly environments.
Interesting. Well, in your book, you say that 2 million years of evolution seem to have the female brain to collaborate and seek for connection, whereas the male brain is designed to compete.
Yes.
So how do we complement each other, and how do we value the difference of the female and the male brain difference?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, but what I hope people will take from the book is how we can really partner intelligently together and get the best of all the brains. And of course, men's brains and bodies contain far more testosterone than the female brain and body. And testosterone is the hormone that drives people to compete. So men on average, tend to be more competitive. Women's brains and bodies contain more oxytocin by, factor that can be between 5 and 20 times more than the male brain and body. That's the bonding hormone, the connecting hormone. So typically women are more likely to want to collaborate and connect. And that doesn't mean, going around just being sort of nice and cozy and friendly to everybody all the time. Women compete as well, but they compete more through relationship than through hierarchy. So it's just a different way of approaching things. And if you know what those differences are at a kind of typical on average level, which is what we're sharing a lot in the book, then you can start to really understand the individual brains that you've got in your teams and the people around you and how those express themselves. And then you can start to figure out how you partner effectively together. So, for example, one of the sort of teams that I've worked with, there are 2 very senior partners in that team. one of whom has quite a female brain and one of whom has a very male brain, when they're going into pitches together, they think through from that perspective. It's like, what are they each thinking about and noticing, and how can they bring that to the pitch? What are the watch outs? What are the things that they might not notice or might trip over given their different perspectives? And they actually leverage the fact that they know they have very different brain sexes to help them pitch and help them build relationships. So when you know what the differences are and you can use that complementarity, it's incredibly powerful and much more fulfilling. That they enjoy their relationship at work much better than they did before.
I understand. Paul Brown, the co-author of this book, says men do what they do in order to find out who they are. Women do what they do because of who they are. I think that explains the main differences between how the female and the male brain works. And it is quite important for the businesses to care about creating brain gender friendly environments. Is that right?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And that phrase, that way of summarizing it that Paul uses, really jumped out for me too, Demet. I know it did for you. And interestingly, what I've heard talking to people is it seems to have kind of resonated more with women than some of the men who've read the book. So I'm curious about that too. But the point is, leaders who really care about the subtleties and the nuances and what makes the brains around them go into a thrive state and not a survive state, those are the businesses that will win, because those are the places where people will want to work, especially young people. The young generation coming through, they will not work in organizations that don't really take diversity in all its forms incredibly seriously. And those subtleties matter greatly, because we're mammals. We're mammals, and our brains can either be bathed in the neurochemistry that enables us to feel safe and perform well, or not.
Well, thank you, Kate. While I was reading your book, it took me back to some memories of my corporate background as a senior woman executive, and I wish I had known about accessing all the brain power of both men and women in the workplace, because you really provide practical analysis and solutions, and it is based on science, what makes it even more interesting. Well, thank you. To link in with Kate, you can send her an invite through LinkedIn, and her website is www.mindbridge.co.uk. You can also purchase this book through Amazon. And if you have enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe to our off-the-shelf book discussion podcast series at the Conference Board website. Again, thank you, Kate, for sharing your insights. And I'm looking forward to reading your second book, if that is on the way.
It's work in progress, Emma. Absolutely. No, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure, and delighted to share the insights, and hope people find it useful and interesting.
Thank you.